Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm June Rawl, the Director for Florida IPDAY, and I'm really happy today to introduce Debbie Berthold from GED Testing Service. Debbie's going to give us all the latest and greatest accommodations for GED testing from GED Testing Service as it focuses on accommodation. But before we get started, as usual, I just want to go through a few of our processes. I'm sure all of you are very familiar with this now, that your attendee microphones are muted, but we want you to ask a ton of questions. So just type those questions into that Q&A section, which you know where that is on your screen, and Debbie will be answering those throughout the webinar. Also, note that this webinar, like all IPDAY webinars, are recorded and they are all archived on the IPDAY website. So you can look for them, use them for recertification. They'll all be in a transcript form on your portal account. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to Debbie and actually thank her so much for taking time out of her busy schedule to give us these accommodation updates. Debbie?
Thanks so much, June. Good afternoon, everyone. It is my honor to be with you today. I'm speaking to you from Minnesota, where today it's 73 degrees and rainy. So in October in Minnesota, we call that a good day. So today we're going to talk about accommodations. We'll do an overview, then we'll talk a little bit about test accommodations. We'll talk about what documentation your students need to be able to apply for accommodations, and then talk about some helping strategies. And at the end, we'll have some time for questions, but as June said, please type questions into the chat feature, or excuse me, into the Q&A feature up at the top if you do have questions, and I'll get to those a little at a time as we go through the presentation. So just an overview, the purpose of accommodations is to provide candidates with full access to their test. Accommodations are not a guarantee of improved performance or test completion. Often we have candidates say, I know I'd do better if I just had extra time. Well, I think we all would do better if we had extra time on time tests, but accommodations are for candidates who actually have a disabling condition, and they're meant to level the playing field. Accommodations are individualized and considered on a case-by-case basis. So we don't say, okay, everyone who applies under ADHD gets the same thing. We review all of the documentation sent in by every single candidate, every page of it, because we never know, maybe on page 37 of an IEP, there's going to be a jewel of information that we might need that will help us approve an accommodation for a candidate. Candidates must have appropriate documentation. And this does become difficult because if candidates haven't been in school for a while, sometimes the documentation they have is very old. But they do have to submit documentation, and there are documentation age limits, and we'll talk about that next. So we have our accommodations broken into 4 disability groups. The first one is learning and other cognitive disabilities. Generally, the documentation for this category would be a psychological report. The report should be within the last 5 years. Now, that being said, I encourage you, if the report is 5.5 or 6 years old, please send it in to us. Let our team take a look at it. If the candidate is taking classes, learning psychological report that's 5.5 or 6 years old with a letter from the current teacher with observations of what's going on in the classroom could be helpful. So don't ever think, well, I'm not going to send it in because it's over the age limit. Please send it and let my team take a look. The next category is attention deficit hyperactivity disorders. This category, the documentation is often just a letter from a doctor saying the candidate is diagnosed with this disability. It's really helpful if we know when that diagnosis was made. And the documentation we used to say needed to be within 3 years, but we have changed that now, and that documentation just needs to be within 5 years as well. That one usually isn't as hard for candidates to get documentation, because if they do suffer with ADHD or ADD, they generally are seeing a doctor. When they get their prescription refills every year, they have to go in for an appointment. And so doctors usually can write an updated letter for them. The next category is psychological and psychiatric disorders. Those disabling conditions, the documentation needs to be within the last year. And the reason is because the effects of those can change rapidly, and we want to know what the current functional limitations are. So we ask for that documentation to be within the last year. Again, if you have documentation that's 15 months old, please send it in, let my team take a look, and if we do need newer documentation, we'll let you know. The last category is physical disorders and chronic health, and again, that documentation needs to be within the last year. The reason is, again, those things can change quickly over time. Sometimes a candidate will need a scribe or recorder to input the answers for them because they've broken a hand or hurt their fingers. Those sorts of things will heal, and the candidate then, upon renewal, won't need to have that accommodation. So we like to have that documentation within the last year. Now, an exception to that is candidates who are blind or deaf. Those candidates, we just need some documentation with that disabling condition. It does not have to be within the last year for those. So a few things that are not considered a disability. And the first one is one that we get questioned about a lot, ESL. Candidates who are, who English is not their first language often ask, can they have extra time? Can they have a reader on the test? We have to say no to that because it is not an ADA disability under the law. And that's the reason we have to say no. We have to go by what the law says, and the law does not consider speaking English as a second language a disabling condition. So unfortunately, the answer is no to that. The other one I want to call out here is test anxiety. Often candidates will request extra time for test anxiety. Again, under ADA, test anxiety is not a disabling condition. However, generalized anxiety is. So my suggestion would be to work with your candidate and find out, are they anxious in other situations? Are they anxious when they drive their car? Is it difficult for them to go to the grocery store? Those types of things could lead to a diagnosis of generalized anxiety, and I would have you recommend to them that they go back to their doctor and discuss the possibility of maybe getting a diagnosis of generalized anxiety. And then that would be an ADA disability, and they could get accommodations. So just something to think about there. We have some new features on the GED. Hopefully everyone on the call now knows about the online request system. It isn't so new anymore. It started in 2016. We do still get a few candidates asking if they can apply for accommodations paper rather than online. The answer is always yes. If a candidate has trouble applying for accommodations online, they can email us and we would be happy to send them the form that they can use to apply for accommodations online. We do hide where those accommodations are, but I will give you that link later in the presentation. And we just do that so that candidates are encouraged to apply online. We find that if we make the paper request forms too available, candidates will just use them. But it's much better for them to use the online request system if they can. And so we try to encourage them to do that. The new thing that we have that we didn't have the last time I had the honor to be with you is web scheduling. So now candidates with approval of extra time and breaks, I call them things that don't require manual intervention. The candidates are now directed to schedule online. So it used to be that all candidates with accommodations had to call the accommodated scheduling line for a person to schedule them. We've enhanced the system, and now people with just a time or time and breaks, those types of things, can go, their approval letter will say, go to GED.com and click on the scheduling tab, and they'll be able to schedule on the web just like everybody else. The people who cannot do that are candidates who have a separate room or are approved for a reader recorder, things that we have to actually work with the candidate to get in place for them. Those candidates in their approval letter will be, again, just as they were before, they'll be given the number to call to schedule by phone instead of being able to go online. But many candidates just request the extra time or breaks, and those now are able to schedule online. So we think that's a great enhancement to our system, and we're really excited that that has happened. There's one question here. Okay, so somebody has asked the question when we went back to who can diagnose a doctor on ADHD, could it be a general practitioner? We leave that up to the practitioner. If they are qualified to diagnose ADHD, then yes, a general practitioner could do that. So it depends on what their qualifications are. Just like everything else, not all doctors are the same. So the answer is yes, it's likely that a general practitioner could do that if they are qualified to diagnose that. So thank you for that question. Okay. So everybody always wants a list of accommodations that are available on the GED test. And I'm sorry to tell you that it just isn't possible for us to provide a list because we try to provide whatever is necessary for a candidate to be able to take the exam. But I list here some of the commonly requested accommodations. So, extra time. The extra time that is available on the GED test is 25% extra time, 50%, or 100%. And I will also tell you those same extra time quantities are available on the GED practice test, the GED Ready. You can order a GED Ready with 25, 50, or 100% extra time. On the Ready, it does not require an accommodation approval. But of course, for the actual exam, it does. Stop the clock breaks. Those time quantities are 30 minutes of testing and then a 5-minute break will pop up, or 45 minutes of testing and then a 10-minute break will pop up. And those breaks are loaded automatically into the computer and they do pop up. So sometimes candidates will write in and say, can you please remove the breaks from my test? I feel like I was just getting going and then the 30-minute was over and a break popped up and it just broke my concentration. So for some candidates, the stop the clock breaks are a great thing. For other candidates, not such a good thing. So again, everything is on a case-by-case basis. The other commonly requested accommodations are a separate room. A separate room is required, of course, if we have the other one here, a reader and or a recorder. But sometimes a candidate with severe ADHD just needs to have a separate room so that they're not distracted by other test takers. So separate rooms are available for candidates. The reader recorder option, reader recorders are hired through a service that we use, a third-party vendor, and they're sent to the test center for the student to use during the testing. That's done at no expense to the candidate for them to have a reader and or a recorder. I see some questions here. I'm going to stop for a second. Can candidates that are in prison be given extra time on the GED, and how do those students submit a request for accommodations? Yes, candidates in prison can have extra time, and the requests generally in the prison come in on paper, and at the end I'll show you where to find those request forms, and then those are faxed in to us. I have a student that had special accommodations during high school. That was over 15 years ago. She receives disability and is on a limited income. How should she go about getting accommodations? We're going to address that in a little while. So if that doesn't answer your question, please ask something again, okay?
Debbie, you have another question that came through the chat, and it reads, we are in a correctional setting and they take the GED through our server. How would that work with accommodations being set?
Right. So even though it's done through their server, the accommodations would be pushed with that, that student's delivery. So they would come automatically in that delivery. Oh, Meryl. Hello, Meryl. I think that I heard you say you can get additional time on the ready test without having applied for and approved accommodations. Yes, that's absolutely true. You do not have to have an accommodation approval to get extra time on the GED ready test. Now, that being said, I would highly recommend, if you have candidates who are requesting accommodations on the ready test, that you would want to be pretty sure that they would be eligible for accommodations on the actual test. Otherwise, that ready test isn't a very good predictor for you. So if you allow a candidate to have extra time on the ready and then they're not approved for accommodations on the actual test, you're not going to be able to know if they're going to be able to, you know, what their outcome might likely be on the actual exam. So I'd be pretty sure they would be eligible for accommodations, but it is not a requirement. Anyone can request extra time on the ready test. Just so you can see what we're up to over here at GED, we, through August, have had 3,389 requests for accommodations for the GED test. 79% of those were approved or partially approved. 20% were found incomplete, and only 1% of those requests have been found not approvable. We'll talk a little bit more about the incomplete ones in a few slides. But pretty much everything that comes through is either approved or found incomplete. And incomplete just means that there isn't enough information to either approve or not approve. We need additional documentation before we can make a determination. So assistive technology, we have some universal access features that are available to all candidates on the GED exam. We have adjustable font, up to 20-point font. Anyone who sits down to take the GED test can go to the top of the page, and there's a tab with a drop down, and they can enlarge their font size. Anybody can do that, does not require an accommodation approval. There's a highlighting tool. Any candidate can use that highlighting tool. Some of the passages, particularly in social studies, are quite long, and it might be helpful for students to be able to highlight as they go along so that when they go back to reread it, they just know what places they need to look at. And color contrast. If candidates have an Erlen sensitivity, they might want a different color palette. So for example, they might want a yellow screen with black print or a yellow screen with blue print. There are 11 color choices on the GED test, and anyone can change to one of those color choices. Now, these universal access features, I would encourage you not to send a student into the testing room and say, hey, by the way, maybe you might want to dial up a different color when you're testing today. You would want to test those ahead of time so your student knows what color combination would work for them. Adaptive equipment, there is an unlimited number of pieces of equipment that a candidate could ask for the GED test. For example, they might need a trackball mouse, they might need an ergonomic keyboard, they might need a special chair, they might need to wear a hat because the lighting is bad in the room. Any number of things. Adaptive equipment we ship from GED to the test center. The exception to that, those of you in the prison, we generally do not ship equipment to you, but we've found in the past you're working with your students using maybe a special enlarged keyboard, and so you already have it on site. It's difficult for us to ship equipment in and out of a correctional facility. But other than corrections, other adaptive equipment, we ship it all around the country, and then it's just there when the candidate comes. The TA helps them get it set up, and they're good to go. Magnification, we do have Zoom text available, so if a candidate needs a larger font size than 20-point font, we have Zoom text available. Zoom text does require an accommodation approval, and it's something that we have to work to push out to the test center so that they have it available for that student's delivery. But Zoom text will enlarge huge so that there's, I mean, it could be so big that there would be one letter on the screen. That's how large it could get, which of course wouldn't make any sense. But it can magnify, and it magnifies everything. It magnifies the charts and the graphs and all of that. So Zoom text is a great option for candidates who are used to using it and who have sort of that in-between vision. So they're not blind, but they don't have good enough vision to use a 20-point font. The Zoom text is a great option for them. And then the last one is JAWS, and JAWS is Job Access with Speech. JAWS is for candidates that generally are blind, and those candidates need to be proficient with JAWS. So, for example, my brother is legally blind and he uses JAWS. When I go to his house and try and help him with something and he has JAWS on his computer, it sounds like a little chipmunk because his hearing is enhanced because of his vision issue. And so he can turn it really fast and still follow along what's going on. But what makes JAWS something that does require you to know about it ahead of time is that basically they're taking your mouse away. Because as you can imagine, somebody who's blind, a cursor has no meaning to them because they can't see where it is. So the cursor and the commands are replaced by keyboard shortcuts that the candidate uses. So if you have candidates who are familiar with JAWS and proficient using it, this may be a good option for them. In addition, candidates that are blind, we have the test in Braille, and we have candidates who request a reader and a recorder. And so that person reads the test to the candidate and then records the answers for them in real time. So we have several options available for those candidates. So we have some emerging trends. Accommodations versus a fundamental alteration. This means candidates ask, oh gosh, can I waive the math portion of the test? I can do everything else, but can you please waive the math portion? Or can you please reduce the number of answer choices? Sometimes in high school, candidates are given the option that they reduce the number of answer choices on all of their tests. Well, once they get under ADA, that is considered a fundamental alteration of the test, and so we're not able to do that. But if you let us know, we can try and come up with some other things, some extra time or something that might help those students. Then we have accommodations versus security. In the world we live in today, it's pretty hard to find things that aren't Bluetooth enabled or that need your cell phone. So for example, candidates who have diabetes, they often today need their iPhone to be able to monitor their blood sugar. So we have to work with those candidates to find a solution for them so that they can test. As if you think about it, having someone take a cell phone into a testing room has lots of security implications. So we work with the candidate. Sometimes the candidate also has a handheld sensor and they can take that in. If nothing else works out, we have been able to have a candidate turn off all the other things on their phone. We have a special cell phone bag that they put their cell phone in, and they do take it into the testing room with them. But those are considered a non-standard accommodation, and all of those things require an accommodation approval. So if you have any candidates that think they need to bring a cell phone into the room with them, they need to apply for accommodations. Then we're getting a lot of non-standard requests. I don't know about your workplaces, but I know here a lot of standing workstations are popping up. So candidates are using a standing workstation at their job, and then they want to use a standing workstation when they come to the testing room. So we have to work through those situations with candidates. Some candidates need low lighting, and so we have to work on solutions to try and help a candidate who needs low lighting. Sometimes it just means talking with them and suggesting maybe could they wear a hat with a visor and sunglasses, and that will take care of the situation for them. So we work always with the candidates to try and find a solution that will allow them to test, but will pass the security issues as well. It's kind of sad that I have to have this slide in here now, but it honestly is becoming sort of an angry world. And so we, I just want you to know we take threats to either candidate safety or staff safety very seriously. We do have issues occasionally, and it's rarely, but we do have them with candidate misbehavior in the test center. Candidate misbehavior is not tolerated. We have policies that we have in place on how we manage that when it's happening and what we do about those candidates after the fact. Sometimes we have to say candidates cannot come back to a testing center until they have a letter from a doctor saying that their safety and the safety of others is okay, and then they're allowed back into a testing room. But I just mention it today just because it's sort of the world that we live in, and we are seeing some of this happening. But please know that the GED testing service is very concerned about the safety of your test takers and those of you that have testing centers of your test center staff. That's very, very important to us. So the review process, the accommodation requests are reviewed by my team. I have a team of 10 people. They not only approve for GED, but many other clients. The documentation guidelines for accommodations are on the GED website, and you'll get that link at the end of the presentation. But all the documentation guidelines are there. When a candidate applies for accommodations through our online request system, the system gives them a link to the documentation guidelines so they have it as they are applying. We make our determination by considering all the documentation. My team is continually calibrating to make sure if one person is doing a review, they'll have the same outcome as somebody else on the team that's doing a similar review. And we send written explanations to the candidates, particularly if they have an incomplete file. Then we write an individualized note to that person explaining to them what kind of documentation we're still looking for so that they can get that and submit again and hopefully get approved for accommodations. So before I talked about that 20% of files that are found incomplete, so I want to talk a little bit about the top 3 causes of an incomplete application. The first one is no supporting documentation. It's a little harder to do this now in our online system because the system does require candidates to send something in, but the computer isn't calibrated to know if, gosh, that's actual documentation or not. So sometimes candidates will just send a letter that they have from Social Security saying this candidate is disabled and receives X number of dollars a month in disability payment. That doesn't tell us anything about what their disabling condition is. So we would consider that no supporting documentation, and we would ask them, explain to them the kind of documentation we need, and then we would call that an incomplete request. Sometimes they're missing pages. This happens often, I think, when candidates submit an application and it's two-sided, and so we get pages 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, but not 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. And so we have to write back and say, you know, we need these extra pages. Or sometimes they send part of the report and they don't send it all. But it's really important for candidates to submit complete reports so that we can read it from beginning to end. Because like I said before, sometimes that little bit of information is deep in the report that we need to be able to make an approval. And then outdated documentation. And we talked about this before. I do encourage you to send in the documentation that you have and let my team look at it. But sometimes it just, unfortunately, is just very old. If a candidate left school 10 or 20 years ago, what we're looking for is the current functional limitations that a candidate has. And sometimes those limitations are greater now than they were when they were in school. So the candidate actually needs more accommodations than they were receiving in school. So that's why it's really important for us to have updated documentation. So I'm going to take a second here and answer a couple more questions. Okay, someone asked how much advance notice is required to get the accommodation approved before the actual test date. Accommodation approvals can take up to 30 days. Now, that being said, when an approval is done, the approval is valid for a whole year. So it's really important to start the process early with your candidates. And actually, I'm looking ahead here. My next slide says that very thing. So thanks for the question, Terrell. Candidates that need accommodations do have to have those accommodation approvals completed before they schedule an exam. And before I worked here, I didn't really understand why that was. But if a candidate schedules an appointment, and that appointment is for a test that's an hour and a half long, and then we come through and we apply, approve them for accommodations, there might be somebody else coming in to test right after that. So they've been scheduled for an hour and a half, but if they're then given double time, so now their test is 3 hours, we don't have anywhere to schedule that. And so that's why they always have to be approved before the candidate schedules a test. So whether a candidate is in a correctional facility or just in the general population, all accommodation requests go through the same system and it takes the same amount of time. We say up to 30 days, just because, as you can see, we do a lot of them. And so sometimes it might come out in 10 or 15 days. Other times it's closer to the 30 days. And it does also depend on what the accommodation request is for. Sometimes if the request is quite complex and we have to do a lot of research, it will take longer. The next question talks about, when I talked about Zoom text before, it asks, does it zoom the pictures, tables, and charts? Yes. In Zoom text, it does everything that's on the screen. So that's the great thing about having a candidate request Zoom text, because it zooms everything, makes everything larger. Okay, so next question is about a tester that has an ankle bracelet. They're under house arrest and they have their phone with them. We've had this situation before, and in those situations we have made arrangements. That candidate would need to request an accommodation, but we've made arrangements to have the phone at the TA's desk, and so it's still close enough that it communicates and it hasn't been an issue. So that would be something you would want your test taker to talk with their probation officer about that, if that would work for them. Okay, I'm going to go back here and we'll come back to these again in a moment. So this is probably the most important slide of all. How can you help your students? We have a couple of things on the GED website that can help. One is the comfort aid list. And again, the link to this will be at the end of the presentation. The comfort aid list is a list of items that candidates can take into the testing room with them that do not require an accommodation approval. So, for example, candidate needs to bring in a little four-legged stool to prop their leg up because they hurt their leg recently. That can go in with no problem. Take a look at the list. And so if you have a candidate that might need some of these things, those things do not require an approval. They can just come to the test center. All of the things on the comfort aid list are subject to approval by the test center staff. The test center staff never touches anything. They just have the candidate hold it and turn it, and they look at it to make sure that it meets the security needs. The next one is lower cost testing clinics. And one of the other questions that we had on here is students who either live in poor areas or are not working and are having trouble being able to get the documentation that they need. So on our website, we have a list of lower cost testing clinics. It's not inclusive, so maybe there's some other places near you. Take a look at what's there, see if any of those would help. Another thing for getting documentation, I always recommend that you encourage your students to maybe look at a service organization, the Lions or those types of places sometimes will help. Kiwanis will help students with the funding that they need to be able to do that. Department of Social Services sometimes will help students. So encourage your students, or you can even make calls. When I worked in GED, I had a pretty sweet setup with a nonprofit organization that would help when I had students that needed documentation for a disabling condition. And they had some funding available and they would help me with that. Assist with the paperwork. You certainly can help candidates with their paperwork. They don't have to be out there doing it on their own. You can help them with that. Again, we talked about encouraging them to start the process early. Remember, the approval is valid for a whole year. Once that year is over, generally candidates can do just a simple extension request form and they can get their accommodations approved for another year. So it's never too early to start the process. So here's some examples of unacceptable evaluators. Just to put these out here, because sometimes people feel that, oh my gosh, maybe my pastor can write something and I'll get accommodations. It has to be a qualified evaluator to approve accommodation requests. So we get letters from these types of people, but we have to go back and ask for an actual diagnosing person to send a report. These generally don't work. And then some outer limits. We do get requests for things like 6 times the extended time. We've talked about waiving a portion of the test, and we know that won't work. Testing at home. Testing at home, we have to find a way for a student to get to a testing center to test. But administering medical care, although our TAs can't administer medical care, we can approve a PCA to attend with the test taker, and the PCA can either be approved to sit in the waiting room and wait and do medical care during breaks, or in cases of an extreme disabling condition, a PCA can be approved with the proper documentation to actually be in the testing room with the candidate. We've had candidates that have been on vents and they need to be suctioned. And so the PCA needs to be sitting right there by them in case there's an emergency. And we can make those kinds of things work. You just need to work with us and we will make that work. So I'm going to see what's up here on, oops, we went to the, let me just see what questions I have. You guys are great with your questions. So the next question, this is a great one. Thank you, Cindy, about IEPs. Are IEPs suitable documentation for accommodations? The answer to that is maybe. Not all IEPs are written equally. And in fact, I had a conversation with one of my team members today. She just had an IEP meeting for her daughter last night. And she said to me, this IEP is more a transitional plan. And that's what we see, is that at some point IEPs become more of a transitional plan. And so it might not have the documentation that we need to be able to approve an accommodation. Okay, so someone says candidate has both an IEP and separate documentation for ADHD. Should they submit both or would one of them be enough? Again, the answer is depends. If a candidate is only asking for some extra time, then maybe the ADHD documentation would be enough. But it never hurts to submit all the documentation that you have and let my team look through it. They're certainly not going to say, oh, well, this says this, so I can't approve it. If the documentation shows that the candidate should have accommodations for one of the things, but not the other, we still will approve it. So the good rule of thumb is to submit what you have and let my team take a look, okay? Okay, so the path to request accommodations, our online request system. We affectionately call it RARS. And RARS stands for the Reasonable Accommodation Request System. The paper forms are replaced with 6 easy steps for the candidate. And actually steps 1 and 2 are just the GED test. That's what's asked for there. So it's really, for GED, it's just really 4 steps. The best part about it is that candidates receive immediate feedback. So in the past, when candidates had to fax in a request, they'd fax it in and then they'd wait. And then they'd wait. And 30 or 40 days later, they'd say, hey, I never got my accommodation requested feedback. And we look and we didn't ever receive it. So I think all of those requests are circling the earth somewhere, and someday they're probably going to all fall down on us. But in this system, the minute the candidate pushes the submit button, they'll get an email back saying, we've received your request. And it will take up to 30 days for us to process it. So that's really great. It's a very secure environment. I know some candidates are really sensitive about submitting their documentation, but don't worry, the system is very secure. Our security team reviews it on an annual basis to make sure that it is as secure as it can possibly be. And then there's no need to pay for faxing services anymore. Some candidates were saying they were paying a lot of money to fax their documents, and they don't have to do that anymore. They can do the online system, upload their documentation, and they're done. Here's the link that you need for the paper request form. Again, we will always accept paper forms. So if you're in corrections, generally, you will have to submit paper forms because the online system requests a unique email address for each candidate. And usually, candidates that are in correctional facilities don't have an email there. So those do need to come in paper, and that's where we've actually tucked the paper request forms are on the new GED.com website. In the corrections section, when you get to the corrections section, just scroll all the way down the page, and at the bottom of the page, there you will find the paper request forms. And then some resources. So our accommodation page, this is where the accommodation page is where you will find the comfort aid list. You'll find the lower cost testing clinic list, and you'll find information about the documentation guidelines for accommodations. That's all here at this page. And then the paper request forms, again, was on the last slide, but here it is again under corrections. And you can just navigate to the corrections page on the GED.com website. I hope you're enjoying the new website. GED worked really, really hard to develop that new site. And I personally feel it's fresh, and now that I'm used to it, easy to navigate. The first day I was like, oh my gosh, where are the things I need? But now that I'm used to it, it makes a lot of sense how it's laid out. And GED spent a lot of time and did user surveys and got feedback from candidates to make sure that they had things in the order that students would be able to find them. And then contacting my accommodation team, you can do that at accommodations@ged.com. That's where you would, you can email and get general questions answered. If you have a question specifically for me, I'm happy to answer that as well. And on the last screen, you'll get my personal email. And please, if you've been on this webinar today, you're welcome to email me, and I will get back to you generally within 24 hours with an answer. The beauty of the accommodations@ged.com is that several of my staff monitor that all day long, and so you will likely get an answer quicker by sending it there. But I am happy to take your questions as well. Okay, so I'm going to go to questions here. Let's take a second to read this. I've asked for accommodations on the GED manager and have not had the answer in time for the GED test. I need to know, do I need to give a 30 days notice when requesting accommodations? So again, the answer is accommodation requests take up to 30 days. Now, that being said, if you have, particularly this might happen in a correctional setting, or sometimes people leave the area. And if you have a student you've been working with and they come to you and they say, we have to move and we're moving 2 weeks from now, and I'd really like to get my testing out of the way, but I need accommodations, or we've submitted that accommodation request and we haven't heard anything, please reach out to me. If you have a person in your correctional facility and you know, often you don't know, but if you do know that they're being transferred to another facility and you would like to have them tested before they leave so they don't have to start the process all over again at a new facility, please let me know. We can make exceptions for those, and I can certainly have somebody on the team do that review for you same day or next day and get it done. Now, please make sure that those are true emergency exception situations, but I don't ever want my teams taking more time be the reason that your student misses the opportunity to be able to test. Next question, if students take and pass a portion of the GED while in prison, is there a time limit those scores are good for? After a certain time frame, do those scores go away and the student has to retake the entire GED test again? No, the scores are the same, whether you take it in the prison system or you take it on the outside. And candidates who take portions of the GED test while they're in prison, those scores will last the same amount of time as everybody else. And at this point, that means they last forever, because there's nothing that goes into the system and says, this is so old, it doesn't work anymore. So you don't need to worry about that. If you have a specific situation, please feel free to contact me and we can talk about it. The last, let's see, question here, how are we defining a slow learner? So sometimes candidates will just submit documentation and the disabling condition will be a slow learner. So it's not our definition of a slow learner, it's the documentation that comes in and says that they are a slow learner. A slow learner is not a documented disability under the ADA. They need to have some sort of an ADA disabling condition to be able to apply for accommodations. And the last one, licensed, I'm actually not sure what this is. Jeannie, if you want to email me with your question, I would be happy to send you a response. How about that? And then that will take care of that one. So here's my contact information. Again, you are welcome to contact me, debbie.berkfeldt@pearson.com, or again, my shared box that my team will answer is accommodations@ged.com. We have a help desk. If you need a quick answer, call the help desk and my team will be able to assist you that way. So at this point, I'm going to turn it back to June. June, thank you for having me today.
Oh, Debbie, we thank you from all of us. Thank you so much for all this information. Understanding accommodations for this high-stake test is so important for us to know, and you've provided us with so much information. So thank you again. But before you leave us today, we'd like for you to get some feedback from you. So you're gonna, before we close out the webinar, we just want to take just one or a couple of minutes more of your time to answer 3 short survey questions. The questions are now going to appear on your screen. So please go ahead and give us your response, and we'll just give you 1 minute to respond to that, and then I'll give you some closing comments. Okay, we'll now close the poll, and I just wanted to thank all of you so much for your service and for your feedback. We hope that you'll join us on our next webinar, which is scheduled for October 10th, and it's going to be called, the title is Traditionalist to Generation Z, Today's Adult Education Classroom. I think you're going to find this webinar fascinating. We'll explore the different generations and how they affect learning and teaching in today's classroom. So with all that, I wish all of you a great rest of the day, and we hope we see you on the webinar next Wednesday. Debbie, thank you very much for your expertise and knowledge on this important field. Bye for now.